Psychoanalysis, Society and Shame. Namaste. Society is not adequately factored into psychoanalysis beyond the unit of the family. Shame is also a late entrant into the central hall of psychoanalysis. With our guide, psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya, we will execute deeper the subject. Namaste, sir. So, society and shame are the late entrance into the central hall of psychoanalysis.
Society is in the guest room and shame is in the waiting room of the fortress of psychoanalysis. Neither of them, even today, as yet, are in the central hall of psychoanalysis. History is interesting. We can survey the evolution of these two concepts in the context of psychoanalysis. The concept of society was first brought in, even while Freud was alive, by one of his colleagues, Alfred Adler. Adler brought in this idea of factoring in society into psychoanalysis through his interest in Marxism and in power structure of the society. So Adler tried to bring society into psychoanalysis through that route. Jung took quite a different route. Jung tried to bring in psychoanalysis into his model of the collective unconscious in a transpersonal way. And Jung also brought society in his model of dream analysis, where he would do analysis at three levels: the personal context, the cultural context, and the archetypal context. And in the cultural context, the society would get factored in the process of dream analysis. Thereafter, Kohut brought up a very important point, and we will possibly repeat this point today, that society is a very important element, not only in psychoanalysis in a conceptual way, but also in genesis of pathology. Kohut pointed out the fact that the type of patients of hysteria that Freud used to get more often are rarely found today. Whereas we find almost a pandemic of personality disorders. And Kohut made this remark and revelation, and rightly so, that in Freud's times, the core problem was of drive frustration. In today's times, the core problem seems to be of object loss or object relations. And therefore, Kohut made this remark that the type of patients that Freud saw was what he calls the guilty man, a man with problems of drive frustration. Whereas the kind of patients that Kohut himself saw and what we see today are what he calls the tragic man. And this brings out a very important fact, that even the genesis of pathology on a mass social scale is a function of society and culture. That in a particular historical time, we find only certain psychoanalytic pathologies to constitute a major part of our practice is not for nothing. It is what it is because that is what society has facilitated, or rather tortured certain people into. So this is a very important element that Kohut brings into a picture of society, how Kohut brings society in. It is also important to note that what is called pathology also varies. If we look at earlier versions of DSM, will classify homosexuality as a problem under DSM. As society changes its attitude, what was once a pathology becomes normalized and goes out of DSM. So DSM in that sense is not strictly a scientific document. It is very much a social document.
Right.
And society, therefore, is important not only in recognizing something as disease, but also in the genesis of pathology. So this is one part of it, the part of society. Now coming to shame. Shame also has been with psychoanalysis for quite some long time. In fact, Freud himself encountered the importance of shame, but he could not explore it further. Freud was himself heavily loaded with his own guilt to really look at his own shame. Given the fact that Freud's model of development of psychoanalysis essentially was autobiographical, it was very difficult for him to accept any fundamental concept coming from anybody else. It had to come from within himself or from his patients. Given that was the case, it was very difficult for him because he was too loaded with guilt to really look at his own shame. However, some of his colleagues did point out to the centrality of shame or the significance of shame, which was then put aside because Freud was too concerned with guilt. Klein carried on this tradition of not giving much significance to shame and giving significance to guilt. And thereafter, the classical tradition continues almost till Kohut. With Kohut, we see a revision and we see shame getting into the center of the discourse. And Kohut brings in shame in many ways, which we'll talk on slightly later. But two things are important that Kohut brings about. One, that we are all on a shame-fame continuum. And shame is a central social emotion. When we talk about social emotions in the social context, shame seems to be the master emotion, as Kohut says. And this is an emotion that we feel when we are about to get caught or get exposed or get persecuted by society. So there is a sense of a withdrawal and recoiling inside out of a feeling of shame. And this, Kohut points out, is a very important feeling, the central feeling of shame as a master social emotion. So after Kohut, shame has been thought of as a master social emotion, and of course, shame is a part of the superego, a process related to the superego, and both the processes related to the superego, guilt and shame, Both are connected to each other. But guilt already is in the central hall of psychoanalysis. Shame is still not there. But we are looking at shame getting significance very soon. And this is where, if we look at the evolution of concepts of society and shame in the context of psychoanalysis, this is where we stand today.
So, how in psychoanalytical today?
Sorry, can you say it again?
How does society go into psychoanalytical today?
Okay. If we take up the first concept of society and explore how deep it is into the psychoanalytic situation today, we can talk about starting from Adler. School of Adler still takes the power relations and the Marxist orientation quite seriously. Jung brought in society in a transpersonal way and directly in the interpretation of dreams, and also in the discussion on individuation, and in the discussion on becoming the whole by a coming together of the yin and yang. So Jungians also take it quite seriously. The real thing, however, has come in very recent times. It has come from Kohut and Lacan. In philosophy, from Heidegger. So Kohut brings in this whole element of fame and shame. And Kohut talks about how very early life shame, because of not being mirrored adequately by parents and society, it creates an intense shame, and a response to that often is an unhealthy self, often a narcissistic self. And the problem there is not to interpret this shame, but allow this shame to come up, allow the grandiosity which preceded this shame to come out and be lived out in the therapy room. Very different approach from Kernberg and classical psychoanalysis. And Kohut also brings in the significance of fame for all of us. So Kohut brings in 3-4 important elements. One, significance of shame as a master social emotion. Two, development of shame very early in childhood, responsible for one of the very important factors responsible for development of unhealthy self. Three, the significance of allowing the grandiosity to come up and shame to be lived out in the therapy room. And four, the significance of fame, how deeply we all long for fame, the significance of admiration, mirroring, and fame, and how we all long for that social admiration. Another important element is from Lacan, and Lacan brings in society into psychoanalysis quite a different way. Lacan's concept of society comes in through two ways. One is the concept of the big other. So in his conceptualization, one gnome is that man is never alone. In the sense, the big other is always there, if not outside of us, then inside of us. And there is no way to be free from the big other, not even in psychosis. In extreme psychosis, even if you are free from the big other inside, you can never be free from the big other outside. So there is no way of being free from the big other inside and outside both. And the big other is a metaphor for society. So Lacan brings in the concept of the big other. And the second important concept is the desire being the desire of the other, where pure desire is rendered into desire, which we call our desire, actually partly by society. So our desire partly is a desire of society. The pure desire is completely ours, but the moment pure desire is converted into our desire, that process involves something from the big other, something from the other. And obviously the other that we are referring to, if the other is a person, that other also is not free of the big other. So the constitution of the other also involves the big other. So Lacan brings in society through these modes into psychoanalysis, the concept of desire of the other, the omnipresence of the big other. And these are very important and fundamental concepts to Lacan. Not to mention the significance of language, because language is one of the most conspicuous signifiers of the big other. We also see how when we talk about pure desire converting into desire, say for example, the desire to flaunt what we have in society. So 1,000 years back, if somebody had a chariot, and very few people had chariots, he would go out in the city riding on the chariot, when most of the people would be walking around. Today, the chariot is substituted by a Mercedes or a Rolls Royce. But the inner desire to flaunt what one has is still the same. In the inner sense, it is still the same race I have and you don't have. So in the inner sense, nothing has changed. In the outer sense, things have changed. So the way pure desire is converted into our desire is based on the outside. So that big other or society determines or influences to a great extent what I call the shape of the desire. That the pure desire is to flaunt one's wealth, but the way it is done is completely based upon contemporary times. So pure desire is innate, but the shape of desire is influenced by the big other, by society. And therefore the society comes in even in what we call our desire is not manufactured in isolation of society. Heidegger goes a step further in his philosophical aspects, and he says the subject which desires, that subject itself is constituted partly by the time in which the subject grows. So it goes even into a structural ontological way that the society is embedded into our minds. That the very constitution of what we call ourselves involves society, and the rendering of the shape of the desire comes later. So even in a more fundamental ontological way, Heidegger embeds society into the human mind. We also see how important society is. People, when they have a loss of faith, don't want to come out of their homes to face people. People commit suicides when they lose everything and they don't want to be ashamed in front of anybody. There is a world of difference between humiliation done in one-to-one context and humiliation done in a social context. People commit suicide to avoid a social humiliation. If we look at army, there is this code of honor. People prefer to die in many armies than to face social mockery and social humiliation. The sense of shame and the sense of honor also are related, just as sense of shame and the sense of fame is related. And shame is fundamentally a social emotion. And we also see how people donate thousands of dollars or rupees to get admiration from society. So we see it in every day, that in abnormal context, in normal context, in even supernormal context, society and shame, both of them play a very fundamental role in the way the human mind works. What we have not done is to look at the concept of society and shame from a public health standpoint. Because when these are not managed properly, too much or too little of them causes a problem. So, public health standpoint, we have not done anything to optimize them. And from a cultural design standpoint also, we have not thought out that in the context of optimizing many parameters in a culture, if you go for a designed culture, how do you optimize these two entities?
Right, right. So how central has shame come to be in psychoanalysis since cohort?
Since cohort, it has taken a different turn, because cohort brings shame to the center. Unfortunately, cohort is not the center of psychoanalysis, so his center is not the center of psychoanalysis. But within his conceptualization, shame acquires a central place. So it may not be in the central hall of psychoanalysis, but definitely it is in the central hall of cohesion psychoanalysis. Cohort brings it up in two different ways. One way is that early life absence of mirroring, idealization, empathy, too much of impingement, not allowing what Winnicott would call going on being. And these don't allow a person to live out one's grandiosity. Another way of looking at, of wording grandiosity, is to word it to say it is a search for fame, a search for experience of admiration and fame. A more accurate word would be omnipotence. But fame also is included in that omnipotence. So one wants to live it out, and because one is not able to live it out or not mirrored by others that one is on the right track, one develops a serious sense of inferiority and shame. And Cohut says this shame is something which is at the root, and this will go only if we allow the person to live out his grandiosity. And if we interpret his grandiosity, the shame will go deeper again and become inaccessible. So for Cohut, the important element of society and shame is that they are more important than classical psychoanalytic pathology generating phenomena, which are the Oedipus, the split being open, and so on. So when we look at the classical psychoanalytic phenomena which we hold responsible for development of pathology, be it Freudian, Kleinian, Bionian, and so on, Cohut brings in a different perspective that even if we have some non-resolved issue there, if the self is strong enough, the ego has the capacity to put a lid on this imperfection, and a person, even without a completely resolved Oedipus or split, may still go on like a normal person. So he brings in another element of health, that not only we have to solve the fundamental psychoanalytic issues, but we can even put a lid upon it. And more often than not, when the lid fails, the latent issues flare up. but actually the latent issues are active in a large section of population which seems healthy otherwise. So Kohut brings this to the center. The second element, and therefore in the therapy also, holding is practiced so that the grandiosity is lived out, self-object experiences are lived out, empathy is internalized, safety is internalized, and the person then can slowly move on his own from grandiosity to realism, and thereby from an unhealthy self to a healthy self. And this brings in another element, that can we have a social version of all the dyadic intense emotions that we see. Not only emotions, but intense dyadic phenomena that we see. For example, we talk about abandonment in a one-to-one context. Now, is there something called social abandonment? Of course, it is there. And that is what people fear, right, of being excommunicated out of the group. And this is very intense in situations where people are strongly connected to the groups. Similarly, when we talk of individual object loss one-to-one, can we talk about a social object loss? Of course, it is there. If you have to leave one country and go to another country, it's a collective object loss, a social object loss. So is there a social version of all the dyadic phenomena that we talk about in classical psychoanalysis? So this is a very important element which Kohut's study leads us to, but we have still not fully explored and integrated these elements into psychoanalysis. Then we have another very important element on the positive side, the ecstasy of admiration and fame. So just as there is this recoil, withdrawal, pain, and the torture of shame, there is this ecstasy of admiration and fame. So we are dealing with a split continuum. And this is very important because people don't talk and don't use the ecstasy of admiration and fame to enhance the quality of life or to counterbalance the damages done by shame inside the mind. And this is very important because in psychoanalysis, we don't use this counterbalancing technique. In the Indian yogic system, this is a very popular technique. So they say, if you cannot go to the root of a negative issue inside of you and unravel it and get over it, counterbalance it by a positive issue. So in their chakra system, they say, if you cannot directly deal with the lower chakras, start with the higher chakras, strengthen the positive part of you, and then visit the negative part of you. That counterbalancing technique we don't use, but it is something that can be used if we appreciate the ecstasy of fame and admiration. We can also see shame in very normal situations. For example, when somebody feels ashamed, there is a complete loss of strength, loss of tone of the muscle, loss of what Kohut calls an unhealthy self. The terror of the omnipresent big other, the terror of omnipresence of society, and a range of difficulties right from social anxiety going on till almost addiction and almost intertwining into guilt. This entire spectrum of events can be associated to shame, right? And also the ecstasy of admiration and fame and things related to that, the positive things on the social scene, they can be used to counteract the difficulties of shame. So slowly we are seeing the centrality of shame, and you still have people who dismiss shame only as a defense. without going into the significance of shame, but my feeling is as more people read Kahoot and practice it, and the more people read Laka and practice it, shame will get more towards the center.
Okay. And how does shame work out in the relation to the therapist?
Many ways. And this again tells us how important the concept of shame is. Let us see how it works out in the therapy room. First, there can be a conscious shame about revealing oneself to the therapist, which the person is aware about. And often he says explicitly that I feel ashamed to talk about certain parts of myself. And the person may hold back for some time because of the shame, or maybe even forever, talking about certain parts of himself. Second, there is unconscious shame, which unconsciously works in repression. That certain things just don't come out and neither of us knows it is repressed. There is shame against interpretation as a response to interpretation. The moment we give an interpretation, the person feels ashamed of himself. Fourth, there is shame, and the shame does not allow fantasy. I am talking about unconscious PH fantasy from even coming out in dreams or in daydreams or our regular fantasy. There is shame of dream analysis. The first time the person is very enthusiastic, but once he realizes what is excavated out of that dream, he is diffident to bring the second dream for analysis. So there is a very intense shame for many people, not all people, but many people, of repeated dream analysis. There is shame of one's inadequacy, that one is narrating something, that this is what happened in my real life today, and suddenly the person feels ashamed of one's inadequacy. There is a shame of not being omnipotent, which is strange, but it is there. It's almost as though we are destined to be omnipotent. Right? There is a shame even related to the desire of fame. People find it difficult to express and accept that they have a desire for fame. And there is a shame related to having the desire of fame, which is ironical, but it is true. There is a very strong sense of shame, either on the surface or buried deep within, in most cases of personality disorders.
Right.
In some cases, it is just on the surface, but in most cases, it is repressed, very deeply repressed. So, that is one very important element. Then there is shame, which is entangled with guilt. That often people have guilt about certain things about which they should not be having guilt, or they believe they should not be having guilt, and they have a sense of shame related to that guilt. So if we see here this guilt shame entanglement, guilt related to shame, shame related to guilt, guilt causing shame, shame causing guilt, both existing independently or both existing together. And we see one of the situations is that there is shame related to some guilt. We see this in ISTDP quite often. The person tries to bring out anger, guilt comes in, we point it out, and after some time he says, I feel ashamed that I am not able to do it. Every time I try to bring anger, guilt comes up. And I feel ashamed that this guilt comes up. So these are many ways in which it comes about. Then you have a shame which is related to and mostly hidden, a combination of embarrassment, irritation, shame, and anger related to one's parents because they are imperfect. they are not as ideal as a child would like them to have. And this shame related to one's parents is quite common and is easily comes out if we are dealing with teenagers. It is more repressed in adults, and over a period of time there is reconciliation also. But in teenager it comes out very conspicuously. There is a shame and rage related to authority figures. Shame of being caught by the authority figure and being exposed and mocked at and humiliated and persecuted. And there is a rage against the authority figure also because of this possibility happening. Then there are rage related to shame. This is also very important. Often we see rage on the surface in the therapy room, and below that is shame. The rage is covering up the shame. And the rage is because of some deep-seated sense of shame about what one is or what one has done or what one has not done. So there is the rage related to shame. And then we have this constant voices of shame and guilt which are tormenting the person in what we call the superego pathology. That there is a constant tormenting by internalized authority figures through the difficulty of shame and guilt. And one very important point that we have not really done in psychoanalysis is to return to Freud, return to Jung, return to everybody else with the concept of shame. For example, how does shame play out in the Oedipus complex? How does shame play out in the split being open? How does shame play out in Winnicott's mother not being good enough? So we have not really taken the concept of shame to reinterpret the classical concepts. So in all these areas, in the therapy room, shame comes out.
Okay, okay. And how do see shame getting itself its rightful place in psychoanalysis?
First thing is to return to the classical schools and revisit their important phenomena and incorporate shame there. So that is like, how do we incorporate shame into Oedipus? How do we incorporate shame into the split being open? So similarly, when we go back to the fundamental concepts that we hold responsible for pathology, can we incorporate shame there if it is relevant? We don't have to force fit shame into anything, but where it can be fit and seems legitimate, we can incorporate that. That is the first thing we need to do to bring shame into the center. Then we have to look at the social aspect of it. What kind of patients are we getting? And as Kohut has pointed out, today what we are getting is a tragic man, not the guilty man. And this has a social public health aspect to it. So we have to bring the consideration of shame and society and the culture into the public health aspect of mental health. Third is into technique. Because as Kohut has pointed out, and I think it is correct, it is very difficult to deal with deep-seated shame with classical interpretation. Not that it can never be done. It does work in some people, but in some it does not. And Kohut is right. And in one group of people, the shame, the grandiosity, if you just keep interpreting, the shame just goes deeper. So the way out is to allow the person to live out the grandiosity, the self-object experiences, feel the safety, and allow that shame to come up. So that is a very different way of therapy and holding. One more element is not to dismiss it as resistance, but to think about it as a very significant concept with its own roots in early childhood, its own manifestation, its own role in pathology, and its distinct way we can heal it. Counterbalancing that is the fact that shame has passed through the evolutionary filtration process. So like everything which has passed from the evolutionary filtration process, shame also must be providing some service to the species and to evolution. And that brings out what are the good parts of shame, and therefore how can we optimize shame. So in the history of psychoanalysis, we see when something is discovered, we say it is responsible completely for pathology. Then after some years, we say in normal people also it is found in a different intensity, in a differently regulated environment. And then we say it has something good to provide to the individual and society. So it's not only pathological, but there is also a healthy version of the same thing. And then we say, let us optimize it. So that history of psychoanalysis tells us that this also needs to be optimized. It is not that it is pure evil. It has its own role in morality, in individual's life and in social life. So we have to look at the management of shame rather than enter into a strict position and attack shame wholesale. This management of shame brings in an element of counterbalancing it by fame, admiration, and positive inputs into the individual. And it is here that positive psychology and holistic healing have developed some good tools and techniques to strengthen the positive part of the individual and enhance the quality of life by leveraging our need for admiration and fame and mirroring.
Right. So it has been a fascinating discussion on shame. Do write us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.